Let's start on today's daf yomi is Bava Metzia daf test. Gemara is discussing the concept of whether or not if you just sit on an animal, that's either a valid method of acquisition, or is it even a better valid method of acquisition than leading the animal? So Rav Yehuda said that riding by itself is not a valid method of acquisition. If you start on the bottom of Chesam Beis, 8 lines from the bottom, Mar challenges this from our Mishnah, which says, "Hayishnayim rochvan al gabe behema." And if there are two people riding on an animal, and then they each split it. So, who do you want to say our Mishnah is like? If you want to say it's like Rabbi Meir said, "Hashta Yoshev Kani." The Meir says that even if you're just sitting in a wagon, you've acquired it. Rachav mibai. For sure, we don't need our Mishnah to tell us that sitting on an animal is a valid form of acquisition. So it must be the Rabbanan. It must be the Rabbanan who argue with Rabbi Meir and say that sitting in a wagon is not a valid method of acquisition. Shema mina Rachav Kani. It must be that it's teaching us that riding on an animal is a form of acquisition of the animal. Meir says, no, that's not what we're talking about. Hachamay eskinon. What we're talking about here is b'manhig b'raglav. When it says in the Mishnah that he's riding, it doesn't mean he's riding. It means he's leading the animal. He's like kicking it with his feet, like when you ride a horse. Well, if that's the case, the Gemara says, well, then what's the difference between that and manhig? You're forcing him to go. Manhig. So the Gemara explains, Trei gavni manhig. Now these are two different types of manhig, and we're being taught that they're both valid ways of acquiring. Ma'adatema, you might have thought, Rachov Adif, that riding is actually better than leading with your hands. Dahamanig vitafesba, because you're on top of it and you're also eating it. Kamash Moan, we're saying from here, no, that they're the same. Okay, so now we say, Gemara is going to challenge the position of Shmuel, who says that riding is not a valid method of acquiring. Or actually, the Gemara is going to bring us support for Shmuel. That riding is not a valid form of acquiring. And the Gemara says, Tashma, Shnaim Shayim Moshem Megamal. We have a brisa that says if two people are pulling a camel, the way you get a camel to move is you have to really be forceful. So they're pulling it. Umanhigim bechamor, or they're just leading the donkey. Or one person is leading and the other one is pulling. B'mida zos kanu. This is on top of Testament. This is a valid form of acquiring the animal. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, that's not a valid form. You have not acquired it until you pull the camel. The only way you could acquire the camel, the donkey, is either pulling the camel or leading the donkey. So the Gemara now brings its proof. How can you acquire the camel and the donkey? Either by pulling or leading it. Does that not imply, like Shmuel taught, that how can you acquire the animal? By pulling it or leading it, but by just riding on the animal, that's not a valid method of acquiring. So this is a proof for Shmuel. The Gemara says, no. No, Shmuel, the brisa could be read that even if one is sitting on it, that's a valid method of acquiring it. And the reason why it says if you pull or you lead, it's lafukim de Rabbi Yehuda. It's to exclude the position of Rabbi Yehuda. It's saying if you pull or if you lead it, that's a valid method. But it's not like Rabbi Yehuda who said Rabbi Yehuda requires specifically pulling by the camel or leading by the donkey. Kamash Milan. So the position of the rabbis in this price is that even if you do the opposite, even if you pull the other one and you lead the other one, that's a valid method. So the Gemara says, well, if that's your case, that the position of the rabbis is that you could pull or lead either one. If that's the case, then the Brisa should have taught them all together. It should have just said, it said if two people are leading, whether two people are pulling or leading, either a camel or donkey, it's effective. Why did it say like this? That it said it in a manner where it should imply it said it like this. It said, Shnayim Shayim Moshchenu Manhigan, whether a camel or a donkey. But in our Bryce, it doesn't use that language. It says Bigamal or Bichamor, which implies that it's not interchangeable. So the Gemara says, you're right. The reason why it lists it like that is because there's one of these methods which wouldn't work. Some say Meshicha B'chamor, that if you just pull a donkey, it's not a valid method. And some say if you lead the camel, it doesn't work. So that's why it works like that. The istimosiv miseifa, and some want to bring usually mosiv means question. Here it really means to be miyashiv. Some want to bring a support for Shmuel's position that riding does not acquire, not from the first clause of the brisa, which we just said, but from the second clause. What does that next clause say? Because it states, B'midazu kana. It says in the brisa, in this manner it has acquired. B'midazu, in this manner, umiyute mai, what's it coming to exclude? Lav umiyute rachov, isn't it coming to exclude the case of where an animal, where you're sitting on the animal, that's not a valid method of acquisition? Whereas no, umiyute ibcha. No, it's to exclude a case where you pull the donkey or lead the camel. Gemara says, I know Rabbi Yehuda. Well, if that's the case, what's the difference between the rabbis and Rabbi Yehuda? They both say the same thing. Gemara says, no, the rabbis have one of these two ways does not acquire. Is the Amri Meshicha B'chamor. Some say pulling the donkey doesn't acquire. Is the Amri Hanagas B'gamon. Some say it's the leading of the camel doesn't acquire. So now the Gemara is going to challenge Shmuel's position who says riding does not acquire. Tashma echad rachov chamor, ve'echad tafas b'mosera. Let's say we have a brayse. It says one person's riding the donkey and one person is holding the reins of the animal. Zeh kana chamor. So one has acquired the donkey, ve'echad tafas b'mosera, and the other one has acquired the reins. Zeh kana chamor. Shmami, now we see from here Rachov Kani. So from the fact that if in this price it says that one person is riding on a donkey and he's acquired the donkey, therefore we see that this is a challenge to Shmuel, who says riding does not acquire. Gemara says no. Here also we'll give the same answer. Achanami b'manik baragwa. No, he's leading it with his feet. Gemara says, well, if he's leading it with his feet, yachi niknei nami Rachov b'mosera. So if that's the case, if he's acquiring the animal, that means, and he's moving with his feet, that means he's holding on to the reins. So why doesn't he also acquire the reins, the one who's sitting on it? So the Gemara says, well, that's how we should amend the text. Ema zekana chamor v'chatzi mosera. So the one who's riding acquires, read it like this, the one who's riding acquires the donkey and half the reins, v'zekana chatzi mosera, and the other one has acquired half the reins. So they're splitting the reins. So now the Gemara says, remember what we said yesterday, that if something's lying on the ground, one person and they both pick it up, you can only acquire, or they're only acquiring it if they also have in mind to acquire it on behalf of the other one who's picking it up, because otherwise half of it is on the ground. So the Gemara says, well, ema zeh kana chamor. So the Gemara says, this makes sense. Bishlam Arachav Kani, it makes sense that the one who is riding has acquired it. The Kamagbale Bendas. It makes sense that the one who's riding it has acquired it because Bishlam Arachav Kani, the Kamagbale Bendas. It makes sense that the one who's riding has acquired the other part. He's acquired his half because the other part of the object has been lifted up by somebody who's of sound mind. But the one who's grabbing a hold of the reins, b'maikana, how is he able to acquire this animal? B'maikana, how has he acquired the other half? How has he acquired his half? The other part of it is in its place. And by lifting up something from Hefker, we had said yesterday, you have to lift up the whole thing. And so therefore, how is he acquiring it? So therefore, we have to say, so we say, okay, so this one acquires the donkey, the one who's riding, and the whole reins. And this one only acquires that which he is holding his hands. So the Gemara says, well, hi, my. That doesn't make any sense. If you want to say, if you lift up an object for your friend, then your friend acquires it. That's where you lift it up with the intent of your friend to acquire it. But this person, he's lifting it up on behalf of himself. He's lifting up the reins on behalf of himself. The guy who's lifting up the reins, he hasn't acquired it, but yet he's acquired it for his friend. So it says Rav Ashi, this is how we have to explain it. Rav Ashi, this one has acquired a donkey, and in addition to acquiring the donkey, he's acquired everything that's on the head of the donkey, which is like the donkey itself. And the person holding the reins acquires what's in his hand. And the other ones does not acquired, and the rest of the reins, neither one acquires. Rabbi Avo, we're in 9a towards the very bottom, like 3/4 of the way down of 9a. So it's probably in the article, probably 9a3 would be my guess, but possibly 2. Rabbi Avo says, "Olam kedikatani." Now we go back to the original version of the Brisa, and we say, "Ho v'yachol anatka laviatzlo." That Rabbi Avo would say. No, we go back to the original form of the Brisa. So this one acquired the donkey, and this one acquired the reins. And how do we, and even the ornaments on the head of the donkey. So if that's the case, why is he acquiring it? So the reason is, since the one who's holding the reins is able to pull it, the head of the donkey, and bring it to him. And so therefore he could just make a yank and it would come to him. That's why he's acquiring the reins. That's what Rabbi Avo says. V'had Rabbi Avo berusahi. This position of Rabbi Avo is wrong. It's external. Kick it out. Because if we're not going to say it's wrong, and you can't, that's not a valid method of acquisition, then a talis shemunechas chatziel gabi karka. Let's say you have a talis that's half on the ground, the chatziel gabi amud, and its half is on a pillar. And then somebody comes and just lifts up the half off the ground. And then another guy comes and lifts up the half off of the pillar. Would you say that the first person has acquired it because he could yank it? But we know that that's not the case. So therefore, we have to say that Rabbi Avo's position is Barusa. So Ella, how do Rabbi Avo Barusa? This position Rabbi Avo is external. So now the Gemara says Tashma. Rabbi Eliezer says the following. So the Gemara is going to bring a proof now against Shmuel. Shmuel said that if you're riding, you don't acquire it. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Eliezer says, Rachov Basada, let's say a person is riding in the field. That's a valid method of acquiring it. Umanik ba'ir, or if you're riding the animal in the city, if you're riding in the field or leading it in the city, that's a valid method of acquiring it. Hachanami, so we see from here, this is a question against Shmuel, because we see from here specifically that if you're riding it in the field, you can acquire it. And Shmuel says riding does not acquire it. So the Gemara says, no, Hachanami, what this is referring to is manik baraglav. This is referring specifically to leading it with your feet, meaning say it's not just plain riding, you're also leading it with your feet. Well, the Gemara says, well, then what's the difference between that and leading? The Gemara explains, these are two types of leading. The Gemara says, well, if that's the case, what's the distinction between the leading in the field and the leading in the city? Why, if you're horseback riding in a city, is that basically not a method of acquiring it? You're sitting on the animal and you're leading it with your feet. Because it's not the typical way of people typically lead an animal or ride an animal in a city. Rashi says it's immodest. Mishum tzniusa, it's immodest. Can you imagine, like, the police, they ride on the horses to intimidate people. So if you're walking in a little narrow place, we're not talking about Washington, D.C., a big city. These are very, very small cities, like 2 or 3 blocks, and everybody else is walking around, and you're riding on your horse like a big shot. No, that's not the typical manner. So it's immodest, so that's not a valid method of acquisition. So Amar Rav Asher, Rav Kahana, if that's the case, because it's not typically done, it's not a valid method of acquisition. If that's the case, if somebody lifts up a wallet on Shabbos, which is also not the typical way of doing things because there's money in the wallet, you're not supposed to lift up a wallet on Shabbos, and it's not typically done. Would you say that's not a valid method of acquisition? And we know it is. He did something inappropriate, but it still works. Okay, so fine. He's riding the horse. He's not supposed to do it in the city, but it should be valid. Mer says, no, we're not talking about a lost object here. We're talking about mekach memkar skin. We're talking about business. Darmalei Kani, where he says to the person, the guy's selling him a horse or a cow, he says, acquire a kederach shebenei adam kohen. Buy it in the typical manner. Top of 9b. And so it's not typical to ride it in the city. What? 9b. 9b. You have it? And so Gemara says, and if it would be in the public domain, Kani, then he would acquire it by riding, because there people ride and don't lead. But in the city itself, that doesn't work. The Adam Chashafu, Kani. And if he's a distinguished person, they don't typically lead the animal, so that's also a valid method of acquiring it. The Isha who Kanya, if it's a woman, she also not typically doesn't lead. Why does the woman not typically lead? Because she, it could be a lot for her to handle. The Yinish Zila, who, and also if it's a guy who's a gangster, is a bad guy, he rides in the city, so he also would acquire it. So by Rebbe Lazar, Omer Chavero. So Rebbe Lazar asked the following question: if somebody says to his friend, "Mishoch be'emazu liknos kelim shaleh mao," says, "Pull this animal, like pull this donkey, in order to acquire the utensils that are on it." Meaning, I don't want you to buy the donkey, but I want you to get the Tupperware that's on the donkey. What will be the case? So first of all, the Gemara says we don't like this language of liknos. That's not the language that you're supposed to use. It's the wrong formulation. Mao liknos. Miyamalei kani. It doesn't mean liknos. It means kani. So he's supposed to use the word kani. That's the proper technical term. So the Gemara says, okay. He says that pull this animal and acquire the utensils that are on it. What would be the law? Would we say that pulling the animal that you're not buying would allow you to acquire the utensils that are on it or not? Oh well, I'm a Rava. So Rava says, so Rava says, you're asking me question 2. You're asking me if you can acquire the utensils without acquiring the donkey. I'm asking you, let's say he says, acquire the animal with the donkeys, would it work? Now, normally we say if you acquire a courtyard, you acquire the utensils that are in the courtyard. But this is not a courtyard. This is a donkey. It's what's called a moving courtyard. A moving courtyard is not a courtyard. It doesn't give you the same ability to acquire the utensils on it. As the Gemara says, Mikan and Kalim in that case, Chatzar Malachas is a moving courtyard. Chatzar Malachas Lokana. A moving courtyard can't just simply acquire the utensils. If you want to say, yeah, no, he means to acquire when the animal stops moving, that also shouldn't work. Anything, if while it was walking, it doesn't acquire it. If it's just standing or sitting, if it's stationary at that moment, it also doesn't acquire it. Gemara says, yeah, there is a way. If you tied up the animal, that's what he meant. So the animal is not capable of moving. So that's the question. So Amrullah, would you be able to acquire the utensils without acquiring the donkey? So Amrullah, Papa Rav Huna Breder Rav Yeshua Rabbah. So he says, well, if that's the case, would you say a moving courtyard doesn't acquire? Let's say you're on a ship Because to dug him, and you caught some fish. The fish jump onto the boat. Would you say that the fishermen have not acquired the fish because the ship is a moving courtyard? Gemara says, he says, the ship is resting. It's just the water that's moving it. It's not a moving courtyard. This reminds me of the question that he said they want to explain pilpul. The way there's a type of learning Gemara called pilpul. So they said, what is pilpul? It says pilpul is if you have some sugar and you drop, what is it that makes the tea sweet? Is it the sugar or is it the stirring? He said, well, obviously it's the sugar, because if you just stir without sugar, it's not going to get sweet. So they said, no, it's obviously just the stirring, because if you put the sugar in and you don't stir, it's not sweet. So the sugar is what allows you to stir, and then it's the stirring that makes you sweet. That's what they're saying here. The ship is not moving; it's just the water that's moving it. So Amalei Ravino Ravasha Me'at. If that's the case, I said Malachas. That was a joke, by the way. Me'at. I said Malachas Pershus Arabim V'Zarakol Get L'Tocheka. Let's say you're walking in public and you throw the get into the woman's sweater or L'Toch Kalas or into a basket on her head. Would you say she's not divorced because she's a moving courtyard? But we know that is valid. I'm like, no, but it's the same idea. The kalasa is mechanaicha. The basket is stationary. She is the one who is walking underneath it. So that's why it's able to be acquired. But a moving courtyard in general doesn't work. Go up to the next Mishnah. Somebody's riding on an animal. Bava Metzia, and he sees the lost object. And he says to his friend, give me. He said to his friend, he sees the Rolex, and he's riding on an animal. He sees the Rolex, and he says to his friend, give it to me. So let's say the friend who he told to pick up his Rolex, the quote unquote friend, picks it up and he says, I got it, Zachaba. And the friend has acquired it. And even though Reuven saw first, seeing is not enough. You have to pick it up. But if once Reuven told Shimon, go pick up that Rolex, I see it, and Shimon picks it up and gives it to Reuven, but then he changed his mind and said, I acquired it first. Then that's not valid, and for a statement by Shimon, and Reuven has acquired it. So the Gemara says, the Gemara is going to introduce a Mishnah from Peah, and eventually the Gemara is going to challenge that Mishnah from our Mishnah. But first, the Gemara gives us a law. Tananas, and we're going to the Mishnah in Peah. Mishalikate is a Peah, somebody who gathers up the corner of the field. Amar Arezu Ploni, he says, Plonion, he says, I'm gathering this up for this very poor man. Is that a valid method of doing something? Rabbi Elazar says, Zachalo. Rabbi Elazar says he's able to do that. No, he should not. He can't do that. He can't acquire it that way on behalf of the poor. The Chachamim say that he should still give it to the first poor man he meets, not specifically to the poor man he picked it up for. And this dispute between Rabbi Elazar says you've acquired it for the poor man. Chachamim say you haven't. This is a dispute if the person who's picking it up is wealthy and therefore he's not entitled to the corner of the field, and he wants to give it to a poor person. Rabbi Elazar savar migudi bai mafkir nachse v'haveyan. He says if he wanted to, he could say all my possessions are ownerless and I'm poor. Therefore, I can acquire it, and therefore I can give it to this person. So therefore, and so therefore, since he's acquiring it on behalf of himself, he can therefore acquire it on behalf of the poor person, and therefore the poor person has it. Rabbanan say it's too attenuated. We're not going to allow you to say two migus. First, I could become poor, and then if I wanted to, since I acquire for myself, I can also acquire for you. We don't say the twice, the two migus. But says, if it'll be from one poor man to another poor man, everybody would say from one poor man to another poor man, he could acquire it. Since he could acquire for himself, he could acquire for his friend. that's like the case. This is a Metzia, so it's like a lost object. And so therefore, just like we said, that as Rava taught in yesterday's daf, since he could acquire for himself, he could acquire for his friend. That both Rabban and Rabbi Lazar would say that according to Ula. So Amalei Rav Nachman Ula. Wait, why don't we say Why don't we say that from one poor person to another poor person is also the argument between the Rabbanan and Rebbe Lazar? That the Hamitzia, a Kohanim Etzla, this lost object, everybody has a right to it. Lost object is everybody's like a poor person vis-a-vis the field, meaning to say everybody has a right to the lost object. V'tanan, and we learned in our Mishnah, Yerochel al Gababeim of Harasa Metzia, V'amar Chaver Taneli, Natla. If he says to his friend, give it to me, he can give it to him. V'amar Ani Zachitiba, Zachaba. And if he says, I acquired it first, he's acquired it. So, meaning to say, our Mishnah says that if you ask your friend to pick it up for you and your friend picks up for himself, he's acquired it. Now, now, if you want to say that the dispute in the Mishnah and Peah is from one poor person to another poor person, so if that's the case, the Gemara's assumption is that first he picked it up, he acquired it for the person who asked him to do it here. So if you want to say the dispute is from one poor person to another poor person, that's what Rebbe Lazar and the Rabbanan are arguing, and therefore the Rabbanan are saying let's nisin money, that our mission that says that if you picked up for one poor person, you haven't acquired it. That's the Rabbanan who. And the Rabbanan say you haven't acquired it, whereas Rebbe Lazar says you have, and then it would be the person who asked him to pick it up. If you want to say the dispute is by a wealthy man and a poor man, and that's what Rebbe Lazar says that you could pick it up on the poor man's behalf. But from one poor man to another poor man, everybody says you could acquire for him. How money? Then our Mishnah, which says you have not acquired it, is not the Rabbanan, not Rabbi Eliezer. So this is a question on Ula. So Ula responds, Amarle, no, completely misunderstand. Masnisin the Amar Techila. Now our Mishnah is talking about a case where the person who picks it up is not saying that he picked it up on behalf of his friend. He says he picked it up at first for himself. And our Mishnah is saying that we believe him and he's acquired the lost object. And indeed the Gemara says, the Gemara is going to prove that this is logical, but we're going to stop here. God willing, pick this up on the Shabbos' daf. We'll do it again at 8 a.m. and then at noon today, and then on Shabbos Kodesh. Anybody have any questions? Okay, so